Now, Peter...
When you say weak working group, does that mean the laws have not yet been passed and their implementation is still in the works?
The laws have not yet been passed, the implementation is in the works, and on the 28th of October 2011 at Cheltenham, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip present, New Zealand was chosen to chair the working group on the change of the laws of succession to the throne of England. New Zealand was chosen. The highest ranking woman in New Zealand is Dame Margaret Bazley. Dame Margaret Bazley was the bag lady carrying the money and the guns for the murders, the assassinations.
This is me archiving the life of Greg Hallett, who was a SKYPE communicant of mine, the world's most informed historian, who understood entirely the sovereignty issues across the globe, the ownership issues of the global mafia who run the countries now in the name of national governments. I'm tying this into my own divorce case. Hallett has been disappeared because of his truths. I expect to be disappeared soon because of the truths I'm telling, which combine the monarchy frauds, which combine the Crown Office, who are hearing my civil divorce proceedings and have already denounced me as a criminal who can never run for MP for evil behaviours the day that my wife's was received in the home that I owned before I met her. Like Greg Hallett, I'm being persecuted, and Greg Hallett is explaining exactly why the world
Peter Williams' client
is such an evil place.
Girlfriend, Karen Sowich, was Peter Williams' junior lawyer. So it was a live-in position. Peter Williams, junior lawyer, was the girlfriend of Terry Clark, and they were living next to Buckingham Palace running the heroin trafficking.
That's really outrageous, Greg.
It's incredible, isn't it? Now,
none of this could be done without the Queen.
That's the Queen, Prince Philip, undermining Britain's sovereignty and running drugs into the South Pacific in Australasia for several decades as head of the Navy, which is why all the planes went missing in the British media inquests.
However,
this man is a Kiwi. He's had umpteen death threats before he left New Zealand on the day of the World Cup final, when the UK police, who are now engaged heavily in corrupting New Zealand, were busy with the World Cup final and the sporting diversions that we mention in almost every video now.
It's actually to do with the striking off from the Law Society of Ed Leary and Billy Boyd, George William Stewart Boyd. I managed to find out the payment schedules for the murders, and this included payment schedules.
Greg has just described, so that's the World of Truth, www.theworldoftruth.net/Hallett report /5 HTML. Greg has just, when I talked to Greg on Skype, it was like taking a cloud off the whole world. What he explained was the motives for almost everything. We had little disagreements about technological issues like HARP, because I believe that gods are capable of much more. If they can create the universe, they can control it and they can regulate its weather patterns. But Greg's understanding of politics and political manipulation was so deep and so impressive because he had suffered for it. He was approached by people making deathbed confessions, and he had visited most of the continents on the globe. He's been interviewed by Red Ice Radio in Denmark, by Jim Fetzer, who's interviewed us a couple of times, and the video that I've just released onto the internet involving the name Cahill shows how deep the deceit is. There's a Cahill made videos on our inept videos which describe the asset stripping of the NHS, the British Treasury, and the geopolitical manipulation of the whole world out of the G8 government buildings. Let's listen a little bit more about what...
And we could probably do an entire show on the payment schedule for the murders and how it went down and who was involved.
I think that would be a very good idea.
This is murders. The funding of the IRA from the drugs running proceeds in the South Pacific, led by Peter Williams QC, who's had Greg separated from his male children. He's had Greg death threatened, and he's had Greg chased all around the world. This video starts with an exposure of how, when Greg Hallett reveals the legitimate monarch to the British throne is a chap who's Portuguese and is stationed in Portugal. He's a relative of Marcus Manuel, and this video encompasses the imposition of people by genealogical breeding chambers into the presidency in America. Bill Clinton is the Queen's first cousin, and all of the treason involving the triumvirate, the drug running people who are actually the parents of Queen Elizabeth II's children. It is sick, and it is continuing to this day, so that organisations like the BBC, Fox News, Warner Brothers, the Murdoch empire can continue to deceive the people and take the funding from the IMF, the World Bank, the ECB and the Rothschild-dominated central banks on every country on the globe and keep the people in turmoil. People like Greg, who explained to, when I said to him, Greg, who owns the media in New Zealand? I understand that Murdoch was released from Australia, and what Greg said to me was stunning for its insight. He said, George, after all I've told you about the world ownership and the manipulation of the world governments, I need to tell you now that nothing in New Zealand belongs to anyone in New Zealand. And this video confirms that. He explains the role of the Queen's Council. He explains the role of the Governor General, who is much more powerful than any elected official in any of the colonial countries. He then describes how David Cameron, in a state of panic because of these revelations, gets the whole of the Commonwealth headship together and makes them change the laws of succession to make only Prince Charles's illegitimate children liable to succeed the Queen to the throne. The revelations that the man makes are stunning. They're on my website under Prof. George Lee's /revelations. If you read the introduction, you will understand the gist of it, and you will see what Greg says about the mafia leading the world is absolutely uncontestable. There's pictures of Nadim Zahawi, who's the British MP for Stratford-on-Avon, at the top of the introduction. If you scan down through that introduction, you'll see all of the illegitimate claimants to the British throne since Queen Victoria had her first baby and her only legitimate non-bigamous baby on the Isle of Wight when she was only 14 years old. That's of Portuguese descent, and it's quite stunning that when I'm in divorce proceedings at Jedburgh Sheriff Court, that the sheriff there is a freelancer. He's trained in a company called let me see, something Manderson, Arnott Manderson Advocates. They run it out of Edinburgh in Scotland. They are not on the British Business Registry. They're a non-limited company. There is no insight into the appointment of a freelance sheriff in any of the district courts in Scotland, how much that man earns, how much of that is case related. And what Greg describes in this entire interview is his persecution by publishers, by newsmen, and by politicians who refuse to receive his correspondence, even although...
And a murderer. And New Zealand's Prime Minister Jim Bolger was a heroin user. I've actually got a photo of him with Prince Charles.
So this involves MI5 and MI6, no doubt.
So the Bolger thing, like the stories I've been telling you about Shipman, Gavin and Stacey, and Shipman being the war correspondent for Iraq, the Bolger issue is the cover-up for Jamie Bolger's murder in Liverpool, which is run like Bristol and like Birmingham and the city hospital there, which is everything that is corrupted has a royal affiliation. And that is not the royals' fault. Hallett is articulate on what goes on in the royals' bedroom. It is vicious. Prince Charles is homosexually raped as a child as a prima nocte right for the people that run the drugs laundering circuits, because they have the power to coerce the family and to divert the moneylenders ever so slightly into more evil behaviours. The country has no capacity to be respected, to be competent, or to be prosperous, because everybody in the leadership teams is twisted and corrupted, and that includes the law enforcement sectors. If you look for Professor George Lees, John Patterson, Gordon Bowden, and a series of YouTube videos we've made on the Law Society in Scotland, on the complete incapacity of ordinary people on narcotics charges, you know, where they're using cannabis on the street corners, they get banged up for a year, but the Governor General gets to be a Knight of the Order of Malta like Jimmy Savile and all the deviants that are brought to power and into the peerage. You can listen to Greg Hallett for hours, and I believe that Greg has been killed. His Facebook page is run out of a place called Kelso where I live, and there's a claim made on his Facebook page that he was educated at Kelso High School. The reason they do all of that, just
so, you know, there's no denying.
Oh yeah. No, I think that most of the public is aware of this.
Yeah, and part of the change of laws of succession to the throne of England was to bypass Prince Harry because it's so well known that he's illegitimate. Here's King Juan Carlos here with his wife Queen Consort Sophia, and here is Prince William with Commoner Kate.
Considerable similarity.
She's a zero. She doesn't count for anything. That absolutely does not add anything. She's not a royal.
So since I became a serious fraud researcher and I began to communicate with world figures like Greg and Jim Fetzer, who analyse these things and try and understand them on behalf of this long-suffering public, I have now been accused of evil behaviours. My wife's divorce team are part of a borders cabal that will not allow me to get legal representation. I've tried from Perth in the central belt of Scotland, or well above the central belt in Scotland, near Glamis Castle, which is pivotal in the stories that Greg Hallett tells, in the stories that Shakespeare tells, and in the brutalisation of Iraq that are down to people like Zahawi, the MP for Stratford-on-Avon, who left Kurdistan when he was age 7 to be educated in a public school in Britain and to become a profiteer in the Commons building where his businesses are registered and they have millions at the bank. These are Prince Charles's illegitimate children. That's Simon Day, who's in Australia. He had his first child with Camilla when she was 18. Princess Diana knows all of this. All of her children were sired by people other than Prince Charles. It's really, really sad that the moneylenders who took control of the world, which is portrayed in the House of Rothschild film around the time of Waterloo and Napoleon, who was actually a direct relative of Louis XIV. There was a body double planted for him. Greg Hallett has told all of these stories on air, and when the revolutionaries came back from fighting the communist menace in Europe, in Glasgow, they were massacred en masse because what they wanted was to have the right to work in their own country. Same thing happened again in 1918, 1919. The Glasgow riots were suppressed by the Scottish Freemasons in the form of the Walter Scott Foundation and the Abbotsford Trust, who still run our part of the world in a corrupt way, in league with George Soros and JP Morgan. And all of those stories have been told. In part, they explain why I cannot find a solicitor, and why Sheriff Halley, spookily familiar and similar to Greg Hallett, has been appointed from Arnott Manderson Advocates to hear my case. Every time I appear in the court, I try and get the proceedings recorded. I'm told at the court door that recording is disallowed, but yet when I go to the pre-hearing for my divorce case, which is actually just an opportunity for me to declare that I will defend my case, which I was not given, they declared openly that everything I was describing in my little diatribe when I stood up, when they asked me whether or not I intend to defend, Sheriff Halley, who is not a full-time Crown employee, he's a freelancer from Arnott Manderson Advocates, he told me that everything he was hearing sounded like an open admission that the litigant or the craver for the divorce proceedings was on solid ground, and her solicitor has referred me to the lowering of the divorce thresholds, so that when a spouse makes a claim with legal backup that the other person has done something wrong, there is no obligation to prove that. There is no obligation even to define the behaviours that are being denounced. That's why I intend to defend, and that's why I'm tying the whole thing into the illegitimacy of family behaviours at the head of our nation, because the courts in Jedburgh are run by the Crown. The people work for the Crown. The funding for the rural law courts is disappearing, and the rural law courts are closing, which is exactly what the global mafia want to happen, so that none of this gets disclosed. So there's Prince Charles. The father of Prince William is Juan Carlos. All of it is twisted. Princess Sophie gets the same prima nocte rights as were portrayed in the Braveheart movie. You cannot imagine that such things happen in a civilized country like Great Britain, but when Hallett describes the shallow graves around Sandringham that are caused by the grooming issues that are caused by the appointment of people like Jimmy Savile and Fairbairn and Mackay to the highest law enforcement posts in Scotland, which become BBC and media jokes in the porridge programme. I've told you about the Bulger joke, I've told you about the Shipman joke, and the dismemberment of NHS by the imposition of the man with the clipboard and the CPD concept. So when Shipman murdered his patients on the Liverpool care pathway, which Greg Hallett mentions in this interview, it is a means of taking the time away from decent professional individuals and diverting them into retraining. And I've made several videos on that. You need to see the videos that I've made on Hogan's Heroes and the Gonculator to see how the technological menace keeps people in fear. The fear of child murders and somebody like Bolger being found dead on a railway track in Liverpool means that mothers have to ferry their children to and from primary schools all across Great Britain for 2 decades already. And when they come out into the blessedly peaceful British playground, they have to get signed off by their teachers. It is mind manipulation on a bewildering scale. And I'm a very articulate person, and I'm a very determined husband. I do not want my children to be brought up in this system by a woman who is prepared to condone everything that I'm describing in these videos, but is unprepared to appear at any of my hearings and denounce me of any behaviours at all. She leaves it all to the professionals who earn £250 an hour. That's Miss Tom. She changes our middle initials, which is identity fraud. They work with the Law Society in Scotland, which means that they do not pay any tax at all, and they use the same laundering tools that my wife's family use to fund the laundering of cash into havens so that they can dismember their profession. They can charge British students who are in the healthcare sector a massive fee now, and they now impose a burden of debt of £50,000 on every honours graduate. In healthcare it's worse than that, because you have got to do a 5-year course and then a 2-year internship. You are enslaved by the system, and the funding, in inverted commas, for that cause comes from the Rothschild Bank. The 2 bosses in government initially were my MP Michael Moore and Vince Cable, the head of the DTI. They have both been compromised severely in their careers for committing those sins, but every politician is obligated to commit to sins rather than to what would make our countries blessedly peaceful and blessedly prosperous. In other words, we could have the money in the Treasury to fund every public sector initiative and every educational initiative that my generation and the Prime Minister's generation took for granted. Now the kids have to pay for every public sector project, and the bill is deferred until 2040 or some such.
It's called Prince Albert.
Prince Albert?
Yeah, it's named after Prince Consort Albert.
And the purpose is to prevent intercourse?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a male chastity belt.
Yeah. Prince Consort Albert wore a male chastity belt. So he did not father any of Queen Victoria's children. And the reason for that was because of Albert's... Well, he was a homosexual, but Lionel Nathan Rothschild fathered all of Queen Victoria's official 9 children. And
so to make sure there'd be no mixture of Albert, and then you'd have an odd lot, you'd have a child that didn't look at all like the other, so you wanted a continuity of the male contribution to procreation.
Yeah. So that was 1840, and then 1850 cameras came in. So the eldest child, Princess Vicky, was then 10. And before she reached 21, Prince Consort Albert was murdered by medically assisted death. And they said it was pneumonia, but actually what happened was he had a cold. They put him in a bedroom, they left the window open in winter and refused to let him out of the bed, so he actually got pneumonia and died. So that stopped Prince Consort Albert being photographed with the children that he didn't look anything like. And the real father, Lionel Nathan Rothschild, was known as the King of Kings, and he was funding the British monarchy, most of the European monarchies, and many of the Asian monarchies. So
he was the power behind the throne.
Absolutely. No question, absolutely no question about that. It's well recorded. Even the punch cartoons of the day, calling him King of Kings and everyone else, all the other monarchs were just puppets to him. So all of Queen Victoria's official 9 children were illegitimate. And the oldest of those was Prince Eddie, and he was an arsonist. And he set fire to 2 castles, and he was also the cause of the Jack the Ripper murders.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, concluding my conversation with Greg Hallett, who is a muckraker extraordinaire. He's been exposing the illegitimacy of the royal family and about to discuss the true source of the Jack the Ripper murders. Please, Greg, continue.
Prince Eddie was the cause of those murders.
So this all hinges on Glamis Castle and the Perth region. Even there, I cannot get a law solicitor to defend me. I've tried to get barristers in England to take it on in Newcastle. I've chatted with them on the phone. These are cases that would be easy to win if someone had the courage to stand up in court and tell the story as it is. Before you tell any story in court, I'm led to believe that the participants who make accusations and who defend themselves are asked to swear on a Christian Bible. If you visit my website, which my wife has denounced as an evil place, my wife never goes to church. She went once to church in our married life, other than for birthing issues and the baptism of children into a Christian belief that she does not adhere to, except for the purchase of the chattels and the eggs and the presents and the Christmas gifts, which is a capitalist triumph. Everything that is associated with religious festivals is now associated with merchandising, and you need to see the Gonculator videos to understand the role of the merchandise, from the Cindy doll through the Action Man puppet to the monkey on your shoulder for PG tips. It is vicious and ruthless, and now the nativity calendars get sold by Marks and Spencers, where my old boss at Imperial College, Miss Manningham Buller, who used to be my wife's old boss at Marks and Spencers, where my wife trained around Miss Manningham Buller's time, they are now asset stripping the country's students. They are appointing academics who are intel specialists. In New Zealand, that phenomenon is called the dot-com phenomenon. It was introduced by a man who travelled around in a fleet of Mercedes cars like Hitler did. But the whole thing is designed to steal your money and to take the competence away from your government and the sovereignty away from all countries across the globe, so that the mafia that run it can be safe in their crimes. So what I'm telling you now is that when you swear on the Bible, and maybe this is why my wife does not attend even the pre-hearings, she does not attend any of the hearings, she has not signed any of the writs. What she's done is to leave the law enforcement to her solicitor, who may well be a Canadian citizen for all I know. It's very difficult to find out facts about legal people in Britain because they're carefully covered up. Look at the videos I've made on Naismith and Stuart Fair and their links to Finchley Road and Mrs Thatcher's boiler rooms. Yeah, everything is tucked away, swept under the carpet, and when the person who's been smoking the cannabis on the street corner comes in and asks for legal advice, they get charged up to £250 an hour to be banged up in prison by these national traitors who are stealing from global citizens using global financial institutions and all of the methods Greg so articulately described. He explained the brutalization of Afghanistan, Iraq Lebanon, Libya, all of that was to sequester the central banks there. He explains the ownership of the world, the key code numbers that the world and the Freemasons laugh at, and the links to the monarchies and the P2 banks. It is absolutely vicious. So what I'm telling you about the 2,000-year-old religious fraud is that when you put your hand on the Bible in the courtroom or in the church service, you need to know that Christianity is a ruthless fraud. That's the man that made the King's Speech. Let's hear what Greg has to say about him.
An illegitimate son of King Edward VII, called Winston Churchill.
Called Winston Churchill of all names.
So Winston Churchill was the biological natural father of Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, and that was actually done by artificial insemination, not by conception. And then Queen Elizabeth was actually born above a pub. She was born above the Coach and Horses pub in Mayfair. So not as
I don't think that appears in her official biography.
So she was born above a pub, and the first person to look over her was a 17-year-old homosexual who became the world's leading treasonous spy, Anthony Blunt. So that was her uncle. And then King George VI went on to have a natural son born on Christmas 1927, which under the current laws would have actually made him a king. And he lived in Rotorua in New Zealand, and it was actually King George VI's doctor, Baron Arthur S.B. Porritt. I think he was Lord then, Lord Arthur S.B. Porritt, who introduced me to him. So that was a private audience with him when I was about 5 3/4.
5 3/4 years of age.
5 3/4 years of age, King George VI doctor introduced me to a King of England.
Fascinating.
Yeah. He lived in Lewis House, or next to Lewis House, in Tudor Manor House, at the corner of Hinimara and Hinimara Streets. And it was at the entrance to the Polynesian Pools, and then the Polynesian Pools was the...
Well, under what circumstances did he arrange to so introduce you?
My father selling insurance. But it was a bit like selling coals to Newcastle, you know, because MI6 runs insurance, so why would you try and sell insurance to an illegitimate royal? His name was George Fitzbarton.
So MI6 runs a lot more than insurance. We've told you in multiple videos how the intel sector now, in between wars, are deployed in the laundering sector, and it is employed really, really dangerously, which is why I've made a video on behalf of my wife's legal team that claims that my wife was registered in companies that involve people of the magnitude of the Cahills, who are killers, who are SAS linked, who are involved in the advising of British Prime Ministers. They're involved also in the recruitment services, in Manpower, on the boards at Manpower, where a loved one of mine worked before we came closer together, and we began to share our own blessedly peaceful and civilized home, with children from all around the region coming to join us openly. Christmas celebrations, Easter celebrations, 4 ultra well funded holidays every year. So what they're talking about now is
Queen Elizabeth's illegitimacy was absolutely certified when she was crowned. She was not sitting on the stone of Scone, so her coronation is invalid. So I'm alerting all of the Commonwealth heads of government that there is a legitimate claim to the throne, and that there has been a legitimate claim to the throne since the 6th of March 1997, and the British monarchy has obfuscated this from public discussion.
I think it's quite remarkable.
Hallett, Halley, obfuscation, Bulger, Bulger, Shipman, Shipman, Gavin and Stacey, the Tyndall Air Base, 9/11, the involvement of the Royals, the Little Red Doll, the links to Schindler's List. If you cannot see it now, you will never see it. Your children will be culled in the next great conflict, and you will never have a conscience about it, because you only pay attention to what the BBC and Rupert Murdoch and the sportsmen tell you. Every sport now has been professionalised and rendered effete, like the man with the clipboard renders every profession effete, incompetent, deceitful, and there to cover the tracks of these criminals, which is why I've had so many run-ins with healthcare, intensive care, sub-Saharan Africa, childbirth statistics, the incapacity of the northern and European countries and the western great countries, in inverted commas, who have had civilized healthcare for 200 years. They cannot share it with the developing world because we are so greedy.
Whenever you've got an illegitimate monarchy, it operates as a mafia, because anyone who's got the knowledge can compromise them. That's why the world is in the situation that it is, because we've had 160 years of false monarchy. So people don't even know what it's like to be under a true king who knows he's king, who's established that he's king or queen. What we've had for the last 160 years is an entire manipulation to delay history for 200 years.
Well, it's really a stunning story, Greg. I can hardly believe it. The fact that they have been attempting to change the laws of succession, however, seems to me about as stunning a form of confirmation as you can possibly have.
I was part of a radio interview on the 22nd of January 2012 on Camelot Radio. I didn't say a lot because the main person was actually launching a book, so I just chimed in every now and then. But I did say that there would be a change of the monarchy this year, and that's happened first in an attempt to not make it change, but they're actually changing it, or trying to change it. And second, in doing so, they've confirmed the story, and they've spent the last 15 years trying to deny the story, and they've finally come up with a solution that confirms a legitimate royal family and have the superior claim to the throne.
Well, Greg, it's utterly fascinating. I'm very glad we're going to continue this series of interviews. Would you like to give a summing up before we have to conclude this one?
So what I'd like to talk about is the latest and greatest royal drug deal. Now, Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth went on a royal tour in Australia 19th and 29th of October 2011, and Prince Philip wasn't able to speak to anyone in Australia for fear of upsetting the apple cart. Now, during that time, a drug formula was developed.
Now, Greg has been a bit peripheral on other issues in global history, like the issue of the jokes that they make about world wars. It's my research that has revealed the role of Mr. Bean, who was Charles Bean, depicted there in his greatcoat, doing his great job for Winston Churchill, who killed hundreds of thousands of ANZACs in the botched Gallipoli campaign, and then in the Blackadder comedies they have a laugh at it. They have a laugh at the extension of World War II by 2 vicious years, which was done by imposing the first members of the the first Jewish members of the American Supreme Court were appointed in mid-war, and their names were Untermeyer and Brandeis. They sparked the hatred for German goods that extended the war by 2 brutal, lethal years, so that the munitions people like Churchill and Beaverbrook, the propagandists in both wars, were able to optimize their profits. The professional soldiers like Kitchener, who tried to end the war early, were just chucked off the side of a ship. like the gem that Britney Spears sings about in those romantic myths about why ships get sunk in the lead up to war campaigns that cull millions of people. So Charles Bean, it was no accident that Mr. Bean was asked to open the London Olympics. Yeah, and it is no accident that what he was playing on his organ, which is necessary in every Christian church across the globe, so you can inspire people that if they put money on the collection plate, that their soul will be saved on behalf of these people. Yet the Queen is the highest ranking official in God's empire in England. Justin Welby, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, is the son of Winston Churchill's private secretary. What they were playing on the organ was the Chariots of Fire music, about a man from Scotland, incidentally, like me, with a funny accent, who was not unprepared to work, but he was unprepared to make the heretical gesture of running for his country in an amateur sport on a Sunday because of his religious beliefs. Christianity is a massive fraud against the world's people. Every one of the indigenous pagans across the globe has been culled for that cause. And here you can see NATO sweeping into the Islamic countries, because it's the only excuse we have left to go there to sequester the narcotics wealth that Greg Hallett described being in the hands of the triumvirate who sire the Queen's children, so that there can be no legitimacy there and the money lenders can still prevail. The people who marry into Aristotle and Onassis are planted into those marriages as agents, super rich people who are prepared to kill their honest husband but to work for their secret services liaison, so that they can die relatively young with loads on their conscience. And there is Aristotle and Onassis, Jackie O's second husband. Our third partner was a man called Templesman, who worked in the De Beers diamond empire and brought down the Lockerbie plane, with a man who was the most honest man at the United Nations, Brent Carlson, on board that plane at the same time. So a double whammy, a massive profit-making exercise, the capacity to divert the attention from Libya, where the leader of Libya was a hero for his people who wanted to keep the central bank in their control. He was done away with on the global news, but dead in a ditch, just because he would not give in to the Rothschilds and give up the issuance of money in his country. Then you get all of the scams that they perpetrate on the Olympics. The Olympic Commissioning Board is habited by Miss Anne Lawrence, which is why the Lawrence case in London has been reopened so many times, because she keeps being exposed as a financial criminal. She's, when the illegitimacy of the British Crown currently is declared, is openly prepared to eat horse meat, just as a diversionary stance. Same thing when you get the exposure that her daughter married Mike Tyndall as a cover-up for the involvement of the Tyndall Air Base in the 9/11 massacre that allowed NATO to storm into Iraq and Afghanistan. There's the paedophile who was involved in the gun license issuance at Dunblane that was gifted the UN leadership as a consequence of his sins. Now we come to the really big issue. The really big issue that appears on the news every time that there is a threat of exposure that Christianity is a massive fraud. The Poppy Fund was run by Butcher Haig for several decades. The British Legion has been run by the Duke of Westminster and by the Duke of Edinburgh, and you can hear what Greg Hallett has to say on him in the background if you listen carefully. Oh, Greg's interview must be finished now. Okay, so there's Douglas Haig, a borderer. He was more interested in returning the horses safely to Britain than he was in returning the troops. And when I told you about that issue in Glasgow, where tank commanders from the south of England were brought in by the Freemasons, the Walter Scott Foundation and Robert Peel on the basis of meetings that they held in London as the eternal anti-communist cull. So when the loyalists defend their country in wartime, the fascists who send them to war cull them after they have returned their weapons. Now you need to realise that Lucky Luciano is an ancient joke. He's a mafia leader from New York, a Docklands man. They were brought back to France and to Italy to cull the returning troops after they had fought for the freedom of their country in a vicious profiteering war run by these people or their predecessors. Okay? The authorship of the New Testament is a fraud. They are taking the piss. The author was a man called Calpurnius Piso. The initials are KP, and that means that every time that someone threatens to expose the religious fraud, then you have to get a diversion in the news. So there's the Arius Piso, one of the relatives, the Alpha to Omega joke. It's the beginning initial and the end initial. When you see Kenyan products launched in the news or a Kenyan supermarket being blown up in the news, you know that you're getting close to exposure. That the whole of the New Testament is encoded. Every time that Joseph appears, it's a new beginning, which is why Joseph appeared in the Old Testament in Egypt and then appeared in Bethlehem, where he was paying his taxes to people like St. Paul, that eventually became heroes and evangelistic missionaries who then enslaved the world, killed all of the pagan nations, and the last place to go was a place called Kievan in Eastern Europe, which is why they made a film about what we're going to do about Kevin and his psychiatric issues. They think it is really funny to steal from the people, to capture their minds for thousands of years and to send them into martyrdom or missionary wars. And it is really, really clever. I would never have believed how clever it is had I not been persecuted by these people in the university sector. I'm a very capable professor of neuroscience and drug discovery, but they have made a massive mistake by alienating me so that the truth can be outed. Every time you see the Pistorius trial on the news, it's a cover-up for the name Piso in that person's name. The whole of the currencies in Latin America are based on the peso. The horse is an icon because of the use of the Latin word hippos. And when you see Report in Scotland presenting their news bulletins every night, where the rector at St Andrews University, who's a local hero in the borders but plagiarised his book on local history, when that news is presented night on night, they have a circle of hippos swimming around above the camera. Everything is corrupted. everything is laughed at. All of the Christian churches, all of the Vatican issues, all of the fascist links to the Vatican, all of the Nazi laundering issues are linked into the money stream that is religion. And when you are a Rothschild, you are really, really clever, because you already own the world and you opt to be a Jewish follower. And then, if anything gets turned on you by way of blame, like the ownership of the Russian steppes, negotiated by Winston Churchill and achieved by genocide in the Armenian area, then you just cover everything up by ethnic hatred and using the anti-Semitic word. And then you pull politicians like the Bush dynasty and the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper into your indoctrination programs, and you make them late in life Lubavitchers. And the use of the word witch, I would not have believed when I was a professor in neuroscience that witchcraft and the occult was still part of world governance. I know now that it is. And I know now, though, that logic and determination is more powerful than any witch on a broom anywhere across the globe. All you need to do to turn the world around is to make a courageous stand and to let the truth out. That's why we've had no news of Lord Patton since I revealed him as a global profiteer and traitor in May. There's my MP who locks me out of his office, who runs corrupted companies. It could be Michael Kevin Moore, who's a director on the Westminster Foundation for Democracy with only 3,000 Ponzi shelves, or it could be Michael Ellis Moore, registered in Dubai, who owned the whole of 85 massive shipping, cruise liner, infrastructure and globalized mail shots, infrastructure and boats out of Dubai, where the Scottish Borders College happens to be. He will not let me meet him. He was a chartered accountant. He now specialises in demonising Islam, because he's been booted out of every other office that he's ever been put in for his sins and his incapacity to keep his promises to his electorate. More of the religious joke, on a similar scale of what Michael Moore does to deceive his people. And you've heard Hallett talking about the genealogical frauds. There's Mrs. Simpson. She was a cross-gender nightmare. She comes from a place called Homer Simpson, the cartoon icon, comes from it's not Smithfield, it's wherever Homer Simpson came from was the place where Ponzi committed the first financial Ponzi scheme, Springfield. They've got Fox News journalists, they've got New World Order musicians. Mrs. Simpson came from there. And she went all around the fascist world, engendering hatred and engendering the Nazi, Norse, Aryan issues that are actually a continuation of the Arius Piso Christian elite fraud that takes Jews and Christians, brings them together for 2,000 vicious years, which is why when Christianity was launched in the Villa Papyri under Vesuvius, that the gods that I know are real and are on my side launched a massive explosion of the volcano, and that home where the Piso fraud was perpetrated from was under lava from 79 AD. In other words, in 79 AD, when we had the Act of God, it was already 80 years after the mythical birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. That's why these jokers needed to invent a time machine and the Daleks. And the Daleks look just like the central bank in Basel, where all of the money laundering takes place in peacetime and in wartime. And people like Mervyn King, who removed regulation from the British system, and Mark Carney are trained to steal from the global people, with input from locals like Malcolm Leslie Rifkind, who operates from Kensington. If you listen to the whole of the Hallett video, you'll realise that Kensington is still a crime scene. Rifkind was the Foreign Secretary in 2002 when Tony Blair and George W. Bush, the second of the butchers in Kurdistan with the Bush name, were involved in taking democracy into war against their will so that they could sequester the last half-dozen central banks on the globe. Rifkind is involved with the war crimes chairperson, Sir John Anthony Chilcot, as an overlapping director at Abraxa, and then goes on to lead companies like G4S and Aberdeen Asset Management. They live a life which is a lie against the people that they purport to represent. There's the name Cahill that I've mentioned in earlier videos. He's an advisor to Prime Ministers. He's an advisor to Prime Ministers like Gordon Brown, also an advisor to Paddy Ashdown on the Irish Troubles. The Irish Troubles, funded from New Zealand, as you've heard, by people like the mass murderer Peter Williams QC, who death threatened Greg Hallett and has eventually had Greg Hallett silenced by whatever means. We're not allowed to know that, even although his videos and his books have been sold to hundreds of thousands or even millions of global citizens. And then we get on to people who run the world as arms profiteers. That's the Thatchers, the Max Aitken dynasty, and Jonathan Aitken is pictured there. He's embroiled in videos that I've made with Gordon Bowden about the murdering of innocent people in rural parts of Britain just because Gordon Bowden is investigating some of the financial crimes that those people who turn out to be MI6 agents have been perpetrating. Those people are then allowed to flee the country using false passports, which they spend a lot of their time creating for people who are international criminals and money launderers. There you can see Sir John Anthony Chilcot and Sir Malcolm Leslie Rifkind on the board of Abraxa Limited, run out of Lothian Road, Edinburgh, like all of the scams of the Cairn Energy team. Cairn Energy has a man on the court of the Bank of England with the leading union leader, Dave Prentice. They all get six-figure salaries. Cairn have no products. It's an entire fraud, just like Christianity. And Gamaliel, like Sir Bill Gamel, is in the Old Testament, and he's in the chapters where St. Paul, the tax collector, begins to take Christianity to the rest of the blinded pagan globe, who take their solace from the sun god and are inspired by the sun, the moon, and the beauty of this beautiful world that the gods created and has been brutalized entirely by humans and messianic figureheads who are myths for profit. And it is really, really successful because it continues to this day, with thousands of companies registered under the name Islam in the UK alone. Then you get the profiteers in the universities, in the media sector, in the literature, in the economics publishing sector, and the Chipping Norton set, the little cabals of power brokers that come together for a laugh. that are stealing from their citizens and are imposing austerity on the whole world. There's Nadim Zahawi, the MP for Stratford, and he has indicted people for war crimes in Iraq and Kurdistan, along with Anne Clwyd. They have a big fall coming at them. His company, like Klaus Moser, the chief statistician for 30 years across all of the profiteering governments, they are run from the Westminster buildings. They are massive crimes against the people, and I want you to know that when I make a video, all of it is researched like my neuroscience. All of it has references, and careful references back to the corporate documents that confirm how many Ponzi shells Michael Moore runs, how many companies involved in geopolitical manipulation out of the House of Commons are run by the MP for Stratford-on-Avon. And you're beginning to hear from Greg Hallett how Shakespeare and the imposition of castles like Glamis and the myth that people were evil, or they had evil wives like Macbeth, and we must not utter those secrets. All of those, like the religious fraud, have been imposed on the world's people and polished up since the 1960s, when the Egyptian revolution took place in the Garden of Eden. That's Eden, which is the Garden of Eden, which was carpet bombed by Sir Alec Douglas Home and our Labour leader Harold Wilson, so that we could protect the BP plant, which is now in the same place in the Yemen, right under Mazrib and Sana'a. It is a vicious master plan by the world's owners, and it has been perpetrated for 2079 and 14 years. My arithmetic is a bit feeble, but it is gonna stop really soon, because the gods are onto it. I know, I also believe in the occult, I believe in wizardry, and I believe that the gods who created this universe are still looking down on it, and they are looking down at the human contribution in horror. Just to show you that my website is real, you can go there, and if you're interested in the religious fraud and why you have to put your hand on a Bible when you go to the court, even for a civil marriage issue, which is used in the church, where they bind you legally together, and then when they tear you apart with the corrupted law enforcement system, your children lose access to the inheritance of your home. The life expectancy statistics in Britain now are that women live into their mid-80s and men live until they're 80-something. That means that if you are involved in a divorce and you want to mortgage the half of your home, then effectively you have to pay off that loan before you get to the age of 67. So nobody who's dispossessed of their home in divorce proceedings can have the capacity to take a loan and to buy their house back. And all of the companies that are involved in the solicitor cabal that will not give me representation are involved in real estate empires. Some of them are tied into the Alec Douglas Home empire, the JP Morgan and the Soros issues that I've denounced, and all of those things are tied into Michael Moore, my political representative. You can see here massive disclosures on the carbon tax. Everything that they do is associated with financial crimes against the people. So global warming when God vents his anger and you get the bizarre weather patterns all around the globe, that is imposed on humans in all of those regions as a tax on breathing. They're consuming carbon and they're consuming oxygen and they're exhaling carbon dioxide, which is also an act of God, but we now have to pay for it, like the VAT that Greg Hallett described in those earlier interviews, and all of the war reparations, all of the taxes that now have every treasury on the globe empty and in sovereign debt.
Had a picture of a single hand grenade and then all of their business enterprises that were running under the transitional regime. What Zahawi does now is that he runs businesses in the House of Parliament. His business directory is actually listed as the Parliament building. Okay, so he's got 5 director listings under Nadhim Zahawi, that's Nadhimzahawi. Yeah, they're in Southwest 1, they're actually in the parliamentary addresses, and it's absolutely stunning that they can get away with geopolitical fraud of this magnitude from there. Okay?
So they're in Southwest 1, like MI6 and the laundering operations, and only last week I revealed that in Southwest 1 we have registered in Eccleston Square Trident 3 and Trident 4, run by mercenary army leader Tim Spicer, and threatening God's beautiful, I don't know how many gods there are, I don't know how many genders those gods have, and whether or not Mrs. Simpson may be amongst them somewhere, but I do know that they are appalled by what is happening across the world, and that they are going to help me and the innocents that helped me get this news out to stop it in its tracks. I'm going to stop there. My website is https://sites.google.com/site Prof George Lee's Revelations, all one word, and in /home. Yeah? When you lay your hand on the Bible to get married or to see through the very expensive divorce proceedings, think about the implications of what you're doing and how much it has cost the world over 2,000 years. I'm going to stop now because that's a bit poignant, and I like to capture hearts and minds and make people aware that my campaign is driven by love and loyalty,